For the following play Pacino was in, Does a Tiger Wear a Necktie? Yes, that's actually the name of the play. Pacino would receive the highest honor a theatre actor can receive, a Tony Award. And yet, that would only be the second most impactful thing that occurred during the run of this play, as this was the performance of his that was seen by movie director Francis Ford Coppola. You know, seemingly out of the blue, Coppola reached out to Pacino, having managed to get a script that he had written in front of Pacino. This script was not The Godfather, but this is where Pacino, despite being afraid of flying, by the way, got on a plane to San Francisco to meet Coppola, where they would spend the next 5 days together talking about the project. Despite this eventful meeting, the film idea got turned down everywhere Coppola took it and ultimately never got made. But months went by, and Pacino was convinced he'd never hear from Coppola again until one day, in the middle of the afternoon, he got a phone call with a familiar voice on the other line. Coppola told Pacino that he was going to be directing The Godfather. Coppola, in Pacino's mind, was an odd choice. He basically didn't believe the news, and to be fair to him, Coppola being only 32, early into his career, and having been relatively inexperienced at making big studio films, and he was also known primarily at the time for writing and directing films that were more experimental, well, this was an odd and risky choice. But Pacino himself was about to make the riskiest choice yet. Because Coppola told Pacino he wanted him to play the lead, Michael Corleone. As Pacino notes in the book, I thought, now he's gone too far. I started doubting whether he was on the phone at all. I didn't even think of it as a shot because I didn't believe it. Who was I to have this fall in my lap? But even once it began to feel real for him, Pacino hesitated. Having only really just cemented his identity as a theatre actor, and having appeared as a lead in only one film up until that point, Pacino actually felt that leaving New York and traveling to Los Angeles to become a film actor would be too distant and different. He recalls turning to his friend, Charlie Lawton, of course, and asking, how do actors do it? You do a scene in a film that you just did, and they say, go and do it again. To Pacino, stage acting was living on the wire, being 30 feet in the air. If you don't make it, you fall. There was an adrenaline that Pacino was hooked on there. But in film acting, as Pacino saw it, the wire was on the floor. You know, you can always come back and try something again. Well, as Pacino also notes, all I knew is there are roles I could play and roles I couldn't. I felt that very strongly. Most parts I thought other actors could play better, and I still think that way. Unfortunately, Paramount Pictures, who were producing The Godfather, also thought the same. Pacino notes that Paramount wanted Jack Nicholson, Robert Redford, or Warren Beatty to play Michael. The writer, Mario Puzo, had written for him to be small, dark-haired, handsome in some delicate way, but no visible threat to anybody. As Pacino notes, that didn't sound like the guys that the studio wanted, but that didn't mean it had to be me. And what's worth noting here, though, is that Paramount hadn't just not liked Pacino for the part of Michael, they didn't like any of the cast that Coppola put forward. I mean, they didn't like Jimmy Caan, they didn't like Robert Duvall, and they particularly didn't like Marlon Brando. Insane to think about what would have been if Paramount had their way with that film. But what it did mean, though, is that Pacino would have to do screen tests for it. You know, there's this insane story that Pacino kind of brushes over in the book that I just had to talk about, where Coppola actually takes Pacino to get a haircut before the screen test in order for him to kind of match the 1940s look that he was going for. Well, once the barber learns that the reason they were in the shop was to get Pacino ready for the role of Michael in the Godfather books adaptation, the barber actually steps back, he takes it in, and then he starts shaking. But it actually turned out that he was having a heart attack. I mean, can you believe it? So if the barber felt that there was that much pressure around the film, then you can only imagine what Coppola and Pacino had to endure during the time where they really had to prove themselves. So to handle this pressure, I noted this passage from Pacino where he talks about his process, right? He talks about how to handle pressure. He says, I did my Zen, this too shall pass thing. I said to myself, go to the character. What is going on in the scene? Where are you going? Where did you come from? Why are you here? And a lesson we can definitely take from this is that in the face of immense pressure and perhaps existential thoughts, focus on the craft, the work, get deeply involved, ask yourself the small in order to deal with the large. Coppola then filmed Pacino's screen tests where he'd sit at a garden table opposite Diane Keaton in what would be the opening wedding scene. And although I love this scene when I'm watching the film, in isolation, it's a bit of a mundane scene that focuses on delivering kind of exposition for the audience about how the larger arrangement of family members and others all connect. So it's a strange scene to have as a screen test because, as Al Pacino notes in the book, it was impossible for the impact of the role to come through here. My interpretation of Michael was like planting a garden. It would take a certain amount of time in the story for the flowers to grow. I love that line. How am I supposed to bring across my ideas about him in this scene? I couldn't bring him to life in this scene because nobody could. And yet, Al Pacino, as we know, landed the role, which he credits to having had Coppola in his corner, something that he notes as being the best thing an actor could have, really. As soon as Pacino found out that he had got the role, he called his grandmother, and upon telling her that he'd be in The Godfather, playing the role of Michael Corleone, she said, "Oh, Sonny, listen, Granddad was born in Corleone. That's where he was from." It's almost universally known by now that even once The Godfather started filming, the pressure on Francis Ford Coppola was not loosened, and that he had to bring the scene where Michael kills Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey up the shooting schedule to be able to give Paramount something of excitement to show, and more importantly, something that would signal that Pacino's character was a bit more complex than the opening wedding scene would suggest. Well, after completing the film for the funeral scene that takes place in a graveyard towards the end of the film, Pacino notes the sound of someone crying. He looked around to see where it was coming from and saw that it was Coppola sitting on a tombstone, profusely crying. This is his words, not mine. No one was going near him, so Pacino went up and asked what was wrong. And after wiping his eyes with his sleeve, Coppola simply said, "They won't give me another shot." It turns out Coppola actually wanted to film another setup that day, and that he had not been allowed to. Even when Pacino lost faith in his own ability to perform a few times throughout the production, his confidence in Coppola's efforts was never shaken because he reflects on this and he says, "One never knows if a film is going to be great. You know one thing, if it's a really good script and Mario and Francis wrote a really good script, there's a chance. An actor comes in and plays his role, but the film is all in what happens after, how an editor cuts it together and how the director figures out the storytelling." And in that graveyard, I thought, if this is the kind of passion that Francis has for it, then something here is working. I knew I was in good hands. I don't need to be the millionth person that tells you how successful or how important or how impactful The Godfather is. But, when looking at it strictly from the lens of Pacino's career, it's amazing to see how this theater stage actor, someone who was unimpressed and actually turned off by the idea of becoming a movie actor, could bring forward such a timeless performance. I mean, this is one of the best movie performances you'll ever see, and it solidifies himself already from that point as one of the best to have ever done it.